Gopa, thank you so much for joining me today and welcome to this conversation.
Thank
And
you.
before we sort of go into, turning points and, catalysts in your life, there was a poem that you shared with me, which I thought was beautiful. It would be great if you start off with that poem and maybe just, explain the context behind why you thought that was such a good poem.
Yeah, so actually, the thing is that my father passed away when I was 18. That was in 1984, so way back in time, 37 years ago. So many years later, when I was going through a couple of his folders, and he was an extremely neat kind of person. Everything had a place and everything would be in his place and in its place and so on. So I was going through one of these folders and I found this little poem inside. And he had cut it out from a newspaper or a magazine. The title of the poem is A Bag of Tools. And it has struck me as probably the most beautiful short little poem that I've ever read. And I know that you were super impressed by it as well.
I loved it. Yeah.
Yeah. And what it says is, isn't it strange that princes and kings and clowns that taper in sawdust rings and common people like you and me are builders of eternity. Each is given a bag of tools, um, something, and I think a framing box or something, and a box and a book of rules, and each can make as time has flown a stumbling block or a stepping stone. Right. So that's the poem. That's
Stumbling block or a stepping stone. I
yeah.
love that. I love that.
Yeah.
So that's kind of been, has that been sort of your mantra in your life since you found that poem?
I think so. Yeah. I think that has been very important for me, and certainly trying to see if I can leave a mark in some way. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mhm.
So tell me a little bit about the turning point that you want to talk about today.
So actually, there were two, three turning points, Rohini, and um, I'm going to. So one was, I think, around the 1980s, and the couple of books that I read that were uh, very different from the sort of books that I would normally read. I was heavily into P.G. Woodhouse, and this is not the sort of book I would have otherwise read. But um, a teacher of mine in college who used to teach us accounts and commerce and stuff like that, he gave me Schumacher's book on economics, and E.F. Schumacher was a British economist of German origin, but very, very different. I mean, in that book, there's a chapter on Gandhian economics, there's a chapter on Buddhist economics. His way of looking at economics was so different from anything that I had seen. And I still have that book, and it's still one of my most treasured possessions.
Mm.
Uh, and I've read it, quite often, read a chapter here or a chapter there. And the second book was Louis Fisher's book on Mahatma Gandhi, which is also a very nice book. That book stayed with me for some time, but Schumacher's book stayed with me for much longer. So that was, I think, one part of it, and the second part was in, you start a corporate career and you go through the MBA, the sort of grind of everything, and then you get into this. And I don't know if you felt it. I think you did, um, from conversations we've had earlier, possibly, but I know that I had this feeling of dissatisfaction. So somewhere this feeling that you are privileged in many ways, and are you going to stay with that privilege, or are you going to do something more? Was a question without an answer. In fact, a big part of, I think, the last 25 years has been really searching for answers, honestly, and
Yeah.
very often not finding them. So 99, I had a very interesting 2-day trip. I went, till then I had never really gone into a forest as I had always gone in as a tourist, a very typical touristy kind of experience. This time I went with a couple of researchers whom I'd happened to meet, and they asked me to come along. And in those days, in 99, rules were a lot more lax than they are now. So we went right into the Bandipur Tiger Reserve, and we were by the Kabini Reservoir, and we stayed overnight in something called an anti-poaching camp, you know, um, with a few forest guards. We were actually on top of a tree because there were so many elephants around. It was not safe to stay on the ground. It was one of the most terrifying nights of my life. I've never been so scared, right? But it was also massively transformational. I mean, I think when I came out that trip, when I recollected and I wrote about it, and I actually sent that note to my boss in office, who is also a big wildlife fan, and uh, he put trust me, he put that idea into my head. He said, "Aren't don't you think that should be your career, doing something on this?" But basically, what struck me was I needed to work with forest guards because they lived. I found this one night terrifying and difficult, and they just lived there. This was their life. So started working with a few, volunteering with a few NGOs which are working with guards and um, with the ecosystem of the guards. Giving them better equipment, field material, and stuff. So it's. I think that one night was really that 2 days out in Bandipur Tiger Reserve were very, very important. The second one, and I was reflecting on this some time ago today itself, actually, was in 2002, just before I took the decision to leave the corporate world. I spent a week in a retreat with the founders of Body Shop, Anita Roddick and Gordon Roddick. And that is a such an unusual experience because so few people would have had it. And they are very different. I mean, they were the flower path generation in a sense. They were really different, and they were worth a few $100 million back then, but you wouldn't guess it if you saw them on the street. They
Mm.
were so different, and they were extremely passionate. Anita Roddick, of course, was the more voluble and emotional of the two, but Gordon was also a very remarkable personality. So they had this philosophy where the objective of business is profits are completely incidental. The objective is you really create transformation and change. So I think the overall impression I got from meeting Gordon and Anita was that business exists for a far bigger reason,
Yeah.
and its profits are very incidental. And I think, frankly, there aren't too many examples like that. But yeah, that's so. I think you were asking about a couple of experiences. I think these are really
Yeah.
transformative.
So I'm sort of, I'm connecting the dots here, and it feels like, the very first seed of maybe doing things differently was planted when you read that book by Schumacher on, a different way of thinking about economics than maybe, what's become mainstream, where economics is very intertwined with capitalism and, profit being king and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
And then meeting, this couple who obviously became the epitome of how doing good can also be profitable. So you don't that having a business does not have to be um, you know profits or doing the right thing. So that's very interesting. And tell me a little bit about how you were able to weave in your other interests, because obviously that was a different take on capitalism. But then what did you change about your life to maybe
Hmm.
find answers to that question you were talking about, that is there more, that is this all there is, or is there more to what I'm meant to be doing?
Hmm. So for starters, I quit my job. That
Did
was a
you have a
great start.
plan on what you were going to do, or did you just decide that this is not for me and so I'm going to quit?
Well, I had a pretty flaky plan, honestly, and it was to become a facilitator in the two areas that I had experience in. One was finance, and the other was negotiation. So it started that way, and that would be my so-called business model. That would be how the money came in. And then, along with a couple of friends, I set up a wildlife group, which was at that time not that sort of version 1.0. It was a very generic kind of wildlife initiative. It wasn't specific to otters, which is what I began to work on much, much later.
Yeah.
Um, and we started supporting small projects that researchers were doing on species that were not at all mainstream, that were unusual. We started working on things like restoration with farmers, doing things which were really following our heart, not the three of us. There were two other guys. So that really went on for a while. And I used to volunteer with a couple of NGOs as well. So it was, I think those were my core activities, but my money came in from the facilitation that I had set up. So I was sort of at some level, you know, riding two horses at the same time.
Yeah. And I just want to take a little step back. So, can you tell us a little bit about what it was you were doing in your corporate career?
After IMB 91 batch, I joined venture capital fund, and I was with them for 5.5 years. And then I joined another VC fund. Um, Again, another 5.5. So about 11 years in all. So 2002 is when I sort of got out of that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it was two VC funds over 11 years.
Yeah.
Mm.
So I have a sort of, maybe a question that hopefully answers something bigger later on. Is that as a
Mm.
VC, investor, you have quite a lot of power in the way the companies that you invest in actually run their business, don't you? Because you influence in some ways, the direction they take
Mm.
and how they actually turn a profit. So did you at that point in your career start to get a sense that you know, perhaps there was a different way of running business, or did that come later for you?
I think that was an independent function because most of the companies we funded were really in the tech business. And it's very much like a horse with blinkers. You look at exiting the moment you invest, and they too look at either giving you an exit or going through an IPO or whatever. So there is no time to think of a larger canvas, or to think of, am I doing something that's making an impact? When I say I am referring to the investee company,
Yeah.
let alone the investor. And this whole underlying issue of meaning in what we are doing is almost considered an irrelevant question. Why should a business have any meaning? After all, it's there, it's business, right? If you want meaning, you set up an NGO or do something in your spare time. I
Yeah.
think that's frankly, and this is a very jaundiced view that I have, Rohini. I think that's a ridiculous way of looking at life. That you compartmentalize things and say between 9 to 5 I am not going to create any meaning, and any meaning has to happen between 5 and 9 before I sleep. You know, I think everything we do should have at least meaning to us, if not meaning to the planet and to others. But maybe it's a isolated view. Maybe it's
Well, I think I'm sort of more optimistic that maybe there's more. That view is starting to maybe become a little bit more mainstream because a lot of people, young people now,
yes,
they're not waiting until they get to their 40s and 50s and close to retirement before they start asking these questions about meaning. They actually want meaning in the work they do, I hope.
yes,
And that in turn then pushes businesses to communicate their meaning to their
right.
employees, because otherwise the employees are not going to stay. But that, I digress. So
Mm, yeah.
actually, so for you then, the VC, the finance world was something you were very familiar with,
Mm,
and you then found a way to create an income stream that was
mm,
sufficient for you to allow you to focus on this other passion. So can we go back to that, the 2 nights you spent in the tiger reserve,
mm,
and apart from obviously getting a sense of the rawness of what nature is like in its authentic, unfettered self, what was it that made you feel like you wanted to go back and do something more than just be a tourist?
yeah. I mean, that's a really lovely question, actually. I think for some people, every one of us, when we go into a forest, there is this sense of magic and wonder about it. And that's very hard to articulate, but it's there. And for me, that was just very gripping, actually. I just felt that if I had a choice to live my life, I mean, I would want to be here. Obviously, not on top of a tree, but with a with reasonable shelter. But that's the reason why all of us seek to go there, and over the years that has, I would say, gone the it's just intensified. And to me, the combination of forest and water, sitting by a stream, not so much a rivers, because I love the Western Ghats streams more than anything in the world, but sitting by a small stream, and which is flowing through a forest, it's just, there's something very cathartic about it. I don't know how to articulate it beyond that, but there's a sense of amazing wonder, and you never know what to expect. But when you sit there, there's so much of joy in the moment, actually.
Yeah.
So, I think those were the reasons, and probably I did not even articulate this to myself. It's just something that I really wanted to do, you know. So
Yeah,
it's
and
very
you,
impulsive. Sorry. Mm.
no, it's fine. You also mentioned that, the question you asked yourself is that, I spent 2 nights there and that these guys are here all the time facing this. And I just maybe want to flesh that out a little bit. Was it that you felt that what these guys were doing was maybe helping tourists like you to enjoy those 2 nights of, almost like dipping into this magic, but being able to then retrieve yourself and go back
Mm.
to your normal life? What did you get a sense that that they needed help, they needed finance, they needed some kind of additional support to keep that magic alive? Or was that you just wanted to be part of that magic more permanently, and so you decided to go down that path? Sorry, that's a very convoluted question, but
No,
hopefully
no,
you're able to.
I think it was more to do with the feeling that they needed help. In the last 20 years, by the way, things have hugely improved for them, but not enough. I think they are real heroes. In fact, the piece that I wrote after I came back in 99, um, I did use the word heroes. So they are our unsung warriors,
Mm,
and they protect so much for us that we are incapable of protecting at a salary that is a fraction of what I would draw. Um, I don't deserve it. When you look at them, I don't deserve the kind of money I make in facilitation, for example. They spend so much more time confronting danger, not so much from wildlife, but from people who are out to, chop trees or poach animals. It's a very, very hard life.
yeah.
So it was, I think, a sense of feeling sorry and feeling that I needed to really help them. That was where I came from.
Yeah. So then tell us what you did. So you made this group, wildlife sort of.
Yes. So we did a whole bunch of little things, um, for the guards in Bandipur itself. I was helping coordinate activities of another national NGO for the guards within parts of Karnataka and so on. A lot of it was to do with trying to see if we could motivate them, uh, see if we could get insurance for them because their jobs were at risk. We got involved with a rural school in Bandipur for 4 5 years, where we worked with tribal kids, and that was insane fun. It was great fun. I just thoroughly enjoyed especially because we had a very committed government teacher there. Um, so we didn't do one thing. We just, the beauty of not having structure is you can follow your heart and do whatever you want to do.
Yeah.
And after all, it's your time, you're spending money, you're not asking anyone for it, it's from your pocket. So we really followed our heart. I think these three of us. And then, of course, the others dropped out after a bit. So it was the Lone Ranger me to take it on after a while. Yeah. Yeah.
And tell us a little bit about some of the challenges you faced, because I mean, the working with the children was one of your highlights, I imagine.
Mm.
But what was difficult about that whole, venture and doing things that perhaps others hadn't really done before?
So many people have done a lot of this. The issue is sometimes you get a supportive government officer, sometimes you don't. If you don't, it's really very hard. You can't do anything. The second is, I think there was such a chasm between us and them that you can't leap that, you can't jump over that. You need somebody in the middle. And very often you don't find that, like we found a committed government teacher, and he was the person in the middle. He was the bridge between us and the children.
Yeah.
But if you were to go and talk to the children or to their parents, in that hamlet where we worked, uh, 80% of the adult population were alcoholic. 80%. And this was largely illicit alcohol. And it was a real challenge to deal with, trying to figure out how to insulate the children, see what would be the impact on them growing up, and so on. And we couldn't cross that chasm, because we couldn't connect to the parents at all.
Mm.
you know uh, it was completely hopeless. So we worked for some years, and then, of course, as that project came to some sort of an end, we left what we were doing.
So what was the reason that there were so many alcoholics? I mean, I suppose there's a related question to that. Then what was the reason these people were doing that job? Was it something that their parents had done and that's all they ever knew? Or, were there people coming in from somewhere else, attracted to the job of being um, what do you call them? Forest guards, or what's their job?
Yeah.
What,
So this hamlet we worked in, there were no forest guards in this hamlet. Well, there were one or two, but most of them were just local folks, tribals who had been displaced from the forest perhaps a generation ago.
I see.
Right? So about 30 years prior to our visit, they had been actually ejected out of the forest. Now, we are, of course, digressing from the main conversation, but in a minute, actually, there is such tremendous inequity in the system that when tribals are displaced, they are really given the raw end of the stick. And there's no money, they're given poor land, and they're taken away from a lifestyle that they have been used to for eons into something that they're completely unfamiliar with.
Yeah.
And to get them to be cheap labor or sources of, let's say, labor, essentially labor, or output of, say, dung or milk or whatever you get from the village, alcohol is a really good inducer for somebody who's, sort of, who's got to contribute that, who has to give that output. So what happened is the middlemen started feeding them alcohol, where inside the forest they still used to drink, but they used to drink on festivals and they used to brew their own liquor.
Mm.
So here you have a different system, and then they get addicted very quickly because it becomes socially acceptable, right? So among tribal communities in many of our areas, even in Coorg where we work, the alcoholic alcoholics rate is very, very high. So yeah,
Yeah,
but that's a
that sounds
digression, but sorry.
that sounds like a really yeah, I mean, it's, I suppose they have no education or any way of, there's no mobility for them. There's no mobility of labor for them to go off into the urban areas and actually find a job there. I mean, is it that they're just trapped in that, in the outskirts of the forest, and then they're being used almost as slave labor to work in
In
the
Yeah,
forest?
in many ways it would be some sort of indentured labor, yes.
Yeah.
And typically what we have seen is it takes 3 generations to break out, if it does break out, right? So we were trying to be with the children and see if we could send them to high school and then on, and see some way to disconnect their lives from the lives of the parents, which is, you would argue, perhaps not even the best thing to do, but that was the kind of prevailing thinking that we had 22 years ago, 20 years ago. But anyway, it's it's a
So that's
story that continues.
no that, but I think it's a really interesting point to bring to life, because maybe a lot of us are not even aware that this happens. we don't know that this is happening, and we if we don't know, we can't help. So I mean, that was 20 years ago, and I don't know whether you're still involved in those kind of projects,
No,
but
not really. Yeah.
was that the kind of starting point of your journey into wildlife conservation? So tell us what happened next from there.
Yeah. So thanks. So we worked together as a small team, doing a few things here and there, and we went out of our way to make sure that we were supporting something that nobody else would support. An individual researcher doing something here, a community saying we want to grow some sapling of a tree, little initiatives with our own pocket money, the three of us. But at some point, the other guys moved on. And then around 2012, something interesting happened. This was in 2012, actually, that uh, I read a newspaper article, actually, an article in a magazine about poaching in India. And in that article, they specifically mentioned that in addition to so many tiger skins and leopard skins that had been confiscated by the police, there were 1,500 otter skins that had been confiscated, right? And I couldn't believe it. I had never thought about this. But many years later, many years earlier, I had been enchanted by this animal, the otter. I had never really focused on it. And then I said, how could people kill this animal? This is so beautiful. This animal is just something that you can't possibly kill, right? Then I started reading up and understood that its pelt was being exported to China and thereon to Europe for handbags, and what was happening with the whole, with organized poaching across India of otters, and certain rivers had been wiped clean of otters. And this was very organized. And then I asked a few of my wildlife friends, who's working on this? Is something being done? And nobody was doing anything. But everybody was wringing their hands, and part of the reason nobody was doing anything is because there's no money for it. If you work on tigers and leopards and elephants, international NGOs will give you grants, and there's some money available in the system, even in India, to protect the what we call the charismatic species or the megafauna, rhinos and elephants and so on. But otters, even today, there's no money, by the way. So I caught up with this guy who was a wildlife biologist, and we sat down and said, can we do something about it? And then this guy, I offered to fund him to join me, and he was anyway quite different. He was really different. He was an engineer who used to hate engineering, and became a wildlife biologist. And he's even today, I think, one of the best otter biologists I've ever seen. He just got a raft, and he rafted down the entire Kaveri River in Karnataka, which is some 300 odd kilometers. He did this virtually all by himself, with a couple of friends for company. So that's when we began to understand what was going on. And like, to cut a long story short, because it is a long story, we really got excited about otters and started working on the conservation side, not so much on the research side, for which I'm completely ill-equipped, but more on the conservation side. And that means two things. It means just raising awareness among people like you and me, people like the forest department, people like the fisheries department, that this species is dying, number one. The second is going to communities who probably are hurting the species and engaging them in dialogue, right? And the second one has been incredibly tough. You know, 9 out of 10 times it has failed, because you're dealing with people who want to kill the species for various reasons. So working with them, saying don't do it, is a very tough ask.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And to that point, I mean, if that is their source of livelihood, then to ask them to not do that would need that they are given an alternative, that look, don't do this, but you can do this instead, to supplement or replace the money you would have got from. So what is the alternative for people who maybe make a living from killing and poaching these animals?
Okay, so actually, the what happened was, around the time we started working, we didn't know this, but the poaching of otters for their pelt as in skin, actually started reducing. and this is absolutely, there was no intervention that created that. It was primarily because of better enforcement by government authorities. We didn't know that at that time. um, but the threats that otters face primarily are from fishermen, not so much from poachers. Because what happens is otters, they feed on fish which are caught in the nets, and then they damage the nets as well. And otters and fishermen just don't like them because their food, their source of income is being eaten up by the otters.
I see.
So that is the conflict, and your question is extremely relevant actually. What do we do? So we really try and engage with them at two levels. One is to say that, look, this is not the animal that's your enemy. There are actually other species there that are doing much more damage in the river. So we try and bring that up. And the second thing that we do is we really fight for their rights. So we've ended up being, you know, going to the fisheries department and making representations on behalf of fishermen, saying, give them this, give them that, just trying to build goodwill and bridges with them. Because really, otters are incredibly intelligent, Rohini. I mean, I can't tell you how smart they are. And you can't you can't stop them doing this.
Yeah.
They're just so smart that whatever you do, they figure your game out very quickly. And we have tried. We've tried quite a few uh, fairly different strategies. So you have to think of how to mollify the quote unquote victim, who is the fisherman here,
Mm.
and give him some sort of, carrot that will help him to not do. Often fails, I must tell you that. They will pocket the carrot and still do what they have to do. But where the main area that we work in, which is a 40-kilometer stretch of river, we have been able to get a reasonable amount of success. So the otter population is more or less stable there. You know,
So what kind of things have you done to help conserve?
so we've run campaigns with mascots, for example, where I had a mask of an otter on me. I didn't look very good, I must tell you. But but anyway, so we go from village to village with a story that is in Kannada, and then there is this otter on, sitting there, and we talk about the animal. We've had a couple of films. We've had representations, films dealing with the species, talking about how its numbers are dwindling. We've had representations made to the fisheries department to get them better equipment. Um, we've had forest officers come in and talk about how important it is, and trying to get them to see that the otter is in many ways their friend. And I'll give you just one quick example of that. There is a very nasty fish which is found in the Kaveri River, which is called the African catfish. It's not an Indian fish.
Mm.
It was brought into India and then it quickly sort of went viral. It's become an invasive species. And this species of fish actually devours other species of fish.
Oh, I see.
So having the African catfish in a river is really, really bad news for all living things, except crocs and otters and so on. For most other species, this thing is an omnivore like nothing on earth, the African catfish. Otters eat African catfish. And all fishermen know that African catfish is bad news.
Yeah.
Also because you can't sell that fish. If you catch the fish, nobody will buy it. I mean, it just tastes awful. I'm a vegetarian, but I know that. So so we bring that bit up. So we show photos of where otters are actually eating African catfish. And then we say, look, these guys are your friend. They're not, they're not against you. So this requires engagement, not over months, but over years, Rohini.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's so interesting because I think the point you made about, you've got to go and tell them stories and make it engaging, because, stories kind of a much better way of educating people than lots of facts and figures, right? So,
Absolutely.
winning people's hearts and minds and, staying in their memory is done more powerfully through stories. So this is one of the ways you've done it. I mean, can you give us one or two more examples about how otters are good for the environment and ecosystem? What benefits does the river system get?
So, oh yeah, of course. I mean, otters are actually, and I'm referring to two species of otters that we work in. So there is a species which is called the smooth-coated otter, which is found in rivers, And typically they're found when the river, when a stream becomes, or multiple tributaries converge to form the river, so to speak. They're not found in the streams, the smooth-coated otter, right? In the little streams in the hills, you find the world's smallest otter, which is called the small clawed otter. And that's incredibly pretty. It's such a cute animal. I've never seen it, by the way. I've only seen photos of it because it's nocturnal and stuff like that. So the thing about these two species is they are the indicators of what's happening in their systems. If they are there and their populations are stable, what it tells us is that what is happening in the river, by and large, is reasonably okay. There are no serious threats. They are mammals as well. So they are our outposts in some sense.
Yes.
I'll give you an example. In the UK, which is where, maximum amount of conservation work has happened on otters, um, what they found many years ago, way before, I think in the 80s or the early 90s, they found that as otter populations were declining, they have a species, you have a species in your backyard, which is called the Eurasian otter, or the Lutra lutra, as the sort of scientific name is. What they found was as the species was declining, probably something else was going wrong. And when they did their water quality sampling, they found a very high level of pesticides in the water. And some pesticides consequently were banned. Waters got cleaned up over a period of time, and the otters bounced back.
Mm.
Today, in fact, this particular species is the only species out of 13 otter species worldwide where the population is actually stable or growing. And UK is one place where, the population is actually increasing. And what's primarily happening is you've cleaned up the river not just for the otter, but for yourselves. I mean, it's also hugely helped the humans who have lived there. So many ways, their future and our future are congruent.
Yes.
We live our lives together. They're not different from us.
Yeah.
I also think they are culturally incredible. I mean, they just like dogs in many ways. They have amazing pack behaviors. They have amazing expressions. I can go on and on. Didn't get me started on this. But
It's
just
great. You
beautiful to
feel
watch.
free to go on about it because I'm learning so much about otters, and I'm fascinated. So do they actually do they do they kind of interact with humans, or are they very shy? How does that work when you actually go
So they
in?
are very, yeah. So by and large, they are very shy, occasionally even aggressive, particularly when they have pups, which happens in winter. Uh, and they keep their distance, right? There are a couple of cases where otters have been reared as pets. Most celebrated cases, a book that was released in the UK 60 years ago. It is an iconic book, Rohini, and you must read it sometime. It's called Ring of Bright Water. And it's about this guy called Gavin Maxwell who reared two otters in captivity. It's a beautiful book and he writes so well. So actually that triggered that sort of fondness for otters in the UK.
So I want to ask you, these changes that you made, obviously it means you have to go away for considerable periods of time to be in, the communities where you're helping with conservation. How has that, how have you fitted that into your, personal life, with your family and your work commitments? How have you found the balance?
Yeah, so that's been a bit of a problem, meaning I have not been able to go away for extended periods of time. So everything that I plan has to be, since I live in Bangalore, I have to do projects which ensure that I can probably leave the city for about 3 to 4 days at a time, not for 3 to 4 weeks, for example. That is quite a luxury which I can probably afford, maybe not even 4 weeks, but say 2 to 3 weeks, maybe once a year or something like that. So that means you have to get your work done by, teams that work with you, individuals that work with you. But that's fine. I mean, it's primarily because I think, you know, uh, I never wanted to miss the experience of being with kids at home. And I don't want to believe later that when my kids have grown up that I didn't spend enough time with them. So it was sort of a balance that we have to walk, isn't it?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
And I think that's such a good point, because I think just because you're passionate about something doesn't mean that you have to ignore everything else and just, focus on that exclusively. And also to the point that, that as one individual, there's only so much that any one of us can do. And the more powerful way to make an impact would be to create almost like a network of people who you also infuse with your enthusiasm and passion, so
Mm.
that it's not just relying on you to increase awareness. And I know you're a consummate storyteller, and of course, your Facebook posts and the way you actually bring humor into things is I think is a really, it's a much more effective way of getting people to engage. So tell me how you've used that skill of yours to maybe get more people to come on board with your cause.
Yeah. So, so let me put it this way, Rohini. My scientific ability on the field is extremely limited. In fact, it is zero, right? I'm very incompetent. My strength is I make friends pretty easily. And one of the ways I make friends is really by joking around with them. And I think that really, really helps. Unless, of course, it is official dumb. If there is some forest officer, etc., you can't do all that stuff. But when you're on the field working with fishers, or when you're with communities which are alongside streams, and you really want to go there and make fun of yourself a little bit, and create a light sort of atmosphere. And that really helps. So there is this one guy in South Maharashtra who's an amazing guy. I mean, he's our real resource person there, and he's a little older than us. Maybe his name is Narayan, but everybody calls him Narayan Kaka. So after about an hour of meeting him the first time, he pulled my colleague to the corner and spoke in Marathi and said, told him that, your boss, I don't know what your boss does for a living, but he has a future in the movies as a clown. so so I thought that was a wonderful compliment, actually, because we've just hit it off,
Yeah.
hit it off like nothing on earth. And so this is a long answer to a short question. So I think this is the biggest strength I bring. So my colleague also tells me, that these guys look forward to your coming in, because you're just joking all the time, and sort of, and in a way, I sort of make fun of them as well. Very often when they do something that they shouldn't do, it's nice to make fun rather than to point it out in a serious way. But
Yeah.
I can only do that once I make fun of myself. Otherwise, they might feel a little threatened. So, making fun of myself is something I'm really good at.
Yeah, and that is so true. And people find it endearing when someone is self-deprecating and humble, and laughs at themselves and doesn't take themselves too seriously. And and in terms of getting maybe other people, other wildlife enthusiasts on board, tell me how that's been for you. I mean, have you got now a team of people who works with you?
So that's a vulnerable issue in many ways for me. The reason is, uh, I'll just tell you very quickly. It's a question of perceived competence, right? And I'm not a wildlife biologist, and I think it's perfectly fine to say I know nothing about otters. I mean, nothing as in nothing from a research perspective. How do you design a research study on otters, for example,
Yeah.
right? I would be able to help now because it's been many years, but when I first started, I didn't. So most biologists who are qualified biologists uh, wouldn't want to work with us. They would much rather work with a wildlife research foundation where they report to qualified biologists and so on. And there is a line between, it's just like in an organization, you have a finance function and a marketing function. In wildlife, you have a research function and a conservation function. Research is about biology, conservation is about people.
Yes.
And to do conservation, you need to understand the biology without figuring out how they did it. So I don't need to know, for example, what is the capture recapture method and so on. I do now, but I never did then. But I certainly need to know how to deal with people. And I can tell you this, Rohini, that most wildlife biologists are not very good in dealing with people. In
Mm.
fact, that's the reason why wildlife conservation has often suffered. They would much rather do field work, come in, do a report, put it up on one of these research platforms, and that's pretty much the end of the story. Conservation is completely about changing emotions and managing people's behaviors,
Yeah.
which is something you talked about as well. It's
Yes.
really, there is no logic behind telling people to conserve a species. Absolutely no logic. There's no logic behind conserving otters as well. I'll be very honest to tell you. I think it's just getting people on your side because they emotionally want to support you or the species,
Yeah.
you know.
So it comes down to, the storytelling aspect, and actually also it's making them see the big picture of why these species are not a threat. In fact, they're a benefit to the ecosystem. But I think it's like anything, when any change that we want to create in people's habits, it's not enough to simply tell them, well, it's like, sort of, I'm digressing a bit, but when in the UK they first announced that they wanted to cut down the number of plastic bags that people were, using in their shopping. So in the old days, you'd go into a supermarket, and with your shopping you got free plastic bags. And then at some point, of course, they realized these plastic bags were ending up in oceans, they were ending up in, the insides of, sea animals. And they started to charge, like it was 5p per bag. And in a way, because suddenly people, if 5p is not much, but just the fact that you now have something that was free, you have to pay for, meant the demand for plastic bags plunged by about 80 or 90%. So sometimes there has to be an economic um, sort of some sort of economic imperative. So I suppose the point I'm trying to make is, even with conservation, if somebody's being asked, don't do this, and it's going to hurt their pockets, then you need to find a way to to give them an alternative so it doesn't hurt their pocket anymore. Or better still, give them an alternative that is even better for them longer term. And I think that's the bit where maybe people like you can really come in, because you got an economics background, you got a finance background, and you're great with people and storytelling. And it's got nothing to do with biology, it's got nothing to do with science. It's got everything to do with human behavior
That's
and
right.
economics. So in that vein, and I know I'm probably throwing you in the deep end asking you this question, what do you think the people that you're trying to get on board, whether it's the fishermen or the people in the villages, what is the one or two things that they need, or that would help them to see that it's a win-win to protect some of these animals?
Yep. So, that's again, I think that's a great question, by the way. These are really splendid questions because they're very important questions. So the first thing, and I'm putting this in sort of decreasing order. The first thing, most people in villages that we work in, often the tribals in forest, the most thing that the first thing that they're really seeking is some sort of status or stature, which is completely absent right now, right? So they just seek some sort of recognition and stature, not on par with you and me, for example, but certainly something better than what they are right now. They also are, in general, very ambitious about their children, by and large. And that's a wonderful trigger to work with them. So sometimes working with them to get their children admission into a high school somewhere, or getting them a token scholarship, goes a long way. Uh, I would say getting them additional income actually comes third in the pecking order. And most of them have some sort of income where they get by. What they don't want is a drastic fall in income. So what we try and do is to figure out ways by which we can get them to get some sort of, we can't increase their income, but we can certainly get them some freebies from the government by speaking to government officials. Or we could see if we can connect them to others who can do things. And we have done some of this earlier, right? And it has had some limited impact. So, for example, in one area that we worked in, the fishermen were told, many fishermen actually end up using dynamite to kill fish, right? And that's really terrible. And we have worked with this bunch of 4 5 fishermen where we have told them, if you don't use dynamite, there is a certain marketing opportunity that you get with a certain clientele, right? In fact, as we speak, this dialogue has entered its second year. They will not change in a hurry, right? Because they're used to doing things in a certain way. But we know that we will get around to convincing them because they're already telling us, asking us questions. So we're saying, if you're getting, let's say, 100 rupees for your fish and you don't use dynamite and you use conventional methods, your catch will come down, but we will get customers in the city to pick up your fish at a higher price. The last one, the third one I talked about, additional money, is a very tough one. We've tried, we've failed, we've come up with models, it takes time, but the first two, stature is quite easy actually. You get somebody to come and give them an award, you get their photos up on Facebook or somewhere, and if you follow my Facebook posts, occasionally I get somebody in like that and I write a little bit, and then I make sure I go back and I show them that your photos on Facebook, or we have done this. So things like that really, really help.
Yeah.
Narayan Kaka, whom I spoke about, I have had at least 2 or 3 Facebook posts on them, and the last time on him, and he once told me, "Can you take a photo of this and give it to me?" So we took a photo of him, which was a part of that Facebook post, and we've given it to him in a frame, so he's put it up in his living room as well.
Yeah.
So that really helps. Yeah,
It's actually, it's a human need to be, acknowledged and recognized and, feel valued, right? So I mean, what you're saying is that these people, just like everyone else, that is more important to them than just money. Um,
absolutely.
and I mean, I'm wondering whether there's any particular wildlife NGO in India that you particularly, you know, think is doing a particularly good job, um, that could become, I don't know, um, sort of a role model of some sorts for other people who are listening to this podcast and thinking about, maybe going down that field themselves.
Well, I would put it this way: there are a number of smaller wildlife NGOs that are doing wonderful work. Um, in general, it's, if I may take a corporate analogy, you find that most of the innovation happens in the small companies,
Yeah.
right? Um, it's no different actually. If you look at the wildlife community in conservation, again, I'm referring primarily to conservation. The primary conservation work in conservation in habitat and wildlife is happening with the small NGOs, ones which are a few guys, few folks coming together, very limited resources, raising money through crowdfunding, don't have access to the large funders. They often actually use their money very wisely, very carefully, and number of them are doing remarkable work. So I'll give you an example, and this is not to do with my kind of conservation. um, well, actually, it is. So there are these two examples from Northeast India. One is this one guy, and we are all three of us friends. We are supporting this person financially. This one guy has been fighting a battle to save the key rhino habitat in this country, which is Kaziranga National Park. And he is extremely courageous. And he's all by himself. He's not affiliated to any NGO. And he was, very demotivated because coming up against a lot of threats and a lot of all kinds of resistance. So we've been supporting him, and he's just an individual. And until we began supporting him recently, he used to pay out of his pocket, and he had a very small time job, and he was doing it primarily out of passion. That's one amazing individual. The second is, there is this uh, lady who's in her 30s, I think, called Purnima Devi Burman. She's doing this amazing community work on a bird which is called the greater adjutant stock, which is a very unusual bird, and it's also a bird that villagers, that particular community where this bird used to roost, they wanted this bird out of there because it's not a bird with very clean habits, and it primarily feeds off a rubbish dump, which is outside Guwahati. But this community has been transformed simply by the way this one individual has worked with the community.
Yeah.
Again, using principles of, take pride in the species in your backyard, and be emotionally connected to this species. It's declining in number. It's actually an endangered species, I think, at the moment. So I'm not giving you a really simple answer. What I'm saying is there are a number of small NGOs. The larger NGOs tend to be more mainstream. In the corporate analogy, they sell soap, right? That's what
Yeah.
they do. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think this is a problem that occurs across all different areas of doing good. That you have the larger NGOs have more money, but they're also more maybe bureaucratic, and there's more expense because they're probably spending a lot of money in getting funding, etc. So is there, and this is me just literally thinking outside the box now, is it possible to have a kind of like a VC version for small NGOs? Because it feels to me like these young people, like the people you just mentioned, they have a lot of passion, and they understand the cause that they're going after. They have the courage to go and do what's needed. What they don't have is the funding, and
Yes.
what they don't have is maybe the time to go and do the fundraising, because you need somebody else to do that, right? So wouldn't it be wonderful if there was a vehicle whose whole purpose was to just like you would in a VC, identify really promising businesses, to help them and give them the funding and support them and mentor, and you kind of, it stops every NGO, every small NGO reinventing the wheel, because there'll be lots of benefits of having a centralized system that does lots of, I don't know, I just think that something like that would be so incredibly helpful to so many people who have the passion but will be crushed by the inability to raise funds, or not having the knowledge of how to use their funds well. So I don't know, it's just an idea. Someone like you clearly has the experience and the skill of doing something like that, and it may bypass the need to become really large. It's kind of almost, it's a vicious spiral, isn't it? That you can't really do enough until you're large and you have lots of funding. But how do you get to that stage? When people don't know about you, or don't know what you're doing, or trust you enough to fund you because you're a one-man band.
I think it's a
Yeah.
fantastic idea. I think it's an absolutely rocking idea. Yeah. I
Yeah.
seriously,
And I think it will help people who maybe don't have the ability, or willing, people like me, who are sort of so uh, you know touched by your passion, but we don't have the ability to come into the forests and engage with the farmers and the fishermen. But if we could help in some way people like you to do what they need to do, then we would do it without having to go to just one particular NGO whose maybe causes tigers or elephants or whatever. So I don't know, maybe something that you and your friends can think about. And I think it may be the way to to encourage more innovation and more people to take on small causes that nobody else even knows exist.
yeah, absolutely. It's a
Yeah.
wonderful idea. Yeah.
So anyway, look, I'm taking up so much of your time. So I want to end with the last couple of questions, Gopal. You mentioned somewhere earlier that perhaps younger than most people, you were asking these questions about meaning in your life, and whether this is all there is to it based on what you were doing then. Have you found more answers to those questions in the years that you've been doing more of what you really wanted to do?
Mm, so I think I've found some answers, um, but you can see from the way I'm saying it itself, I mean, they're not satisfactory answers. What I mean is, part of the problem is that are we asking the right questions, right? And I think I have found some answers and found it by stumbling, making lots of mistakes, lots of failure, that sort of thing. So you have figured some bits out. The biggest issue that we I don't think many people have the answer to, that is, how do you really scale this to make serious impact? How do you create impact across geographies, for example, rather than just work in one landscape or two landscapes? So we work in right now two landscapes, right? And landscape is defined as a fairly large area of, maybe, river would be 40 km of stretch, 40 km stretch of river, etc. But can you scale it over geography? That's a tough one. um, so the answer to your question is, I have answers, but and I'm very glad that I took that leap when I did,
Yeah.
um, because it meant making tons of mistakes and going down the wrong path and then retracing and trying something new. I think I do have a few answers, but not completely there. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Does that answer your
And
question?
it,
So,
it
yeah.
does. It does. I think, I was just going to come back with a small observation that, the whole, I suppose, focus on scaling up a business, again, it's very business. It's a very business, it's business speak, isn't it? Can we scale up? Can we, expand our reach, etc.? And I just wonder whether in space of conservation and, doing good, maybe that is not the analogy to think of. Is It's more like, can we infect, how can we infect more people with the enthusiasm? I know infect is the wrong word in these COVID times, but it's like, think about the virus, how it's just gone and spread. It's spread across the world without anyone actively trying to infect other people. Do you see what I mean? So I
Mm.
think if it was possible for people like you to just infect other people across the world with the enthusiasm to go and save otters, then it means that it takes the onus off you to go and, physically go and build those
Mm.
things. So like create this network of fellow enthusiasts who will then go and do, and maybe have a portal where you all chat about your challenges and you learn from each other. Because I think that's got to be the way forward for any such, project that is not about money, that's not about, a return in the more business sense of the word. And it's not about being precious that, this is my way of doing it, and if you do it, you have to do it my way. No, just say, look, this is how I've done it. What do you think? If you want to do it, and sharing ideas and making it an open source kind of platform. I mean, I don't know. I'm
So
I'm
can I
sitting here
make a
giving
quick
you
point
giving you
there?
these answers as if I'm some big expert. But
Can I make a quick point there? Is that
yeah,
okay?
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, very quickly. The year I was born, Rohini, 1965 is the year I was born. Um, Tigers were being shot in this country. Tigers were considered vermin, right? Um, and then there was, in the 1980s, the romance of the tiger began. The romance with the tiger began. By 2000, 2010, right, these became such iconic animals in this country that today anybody pretty much would say we stand for this animal. By which I mean, I just don't mean, being a Facebook warrior. I mean actually fighting to even save animals, tigers that are known man eaters.
yeah,
In fact, the science tells us that if a tiger is a man eater, we should put it down. In the interest of the species, you should put it down, right? Because it will just kill more people and there'll be more people against the species in general. But why I'm saying that is, this is what you're saying is absolutely my life's quest, actually. When I told you I had figured out this one answer, which is not completely satisfactory, my dream is to make the otter the tiger of the river,
yeah,
right? I want, if I can create that sense of beauty around the species and say that, this is the animal that represents you in the river and this is the tiger of the river, right? I think that's the viral effect.
yes,
That's
yeah,
what I really want from, the work that we are doing.
And
Yeah.
how are you going to do that, Gopas? And in this podcast, you have put out a vision to make the otter the tiger of the river. I love that. So how do you what are the two or three things that you can do to do that?
So the first thing is, you've got to influence people who have the maximum power to protect whatever needs to be protected. So those are the fisheries department and the forest department, and we keep going to them. We keep submitting stuff until, of course, COVID started last year. But we used to go to them and meet them and talk about, there are otters here, and this is what is happening, and so on and so forth. With the fisheries department, we had to educate them that such a species is not a problem, because they were on the side of the fishermen. Really, that's their constituency. So it's the people who have the maximum power. Then we've created a number of groups on social media to work on this. Then we start. So I do, just to tell you, last month I did uh, I did 3 Zoom calls in June with 3 bunches of kids, right? And just talking about, and I asked them to call me, two groups called me Otter Uncle. I said, I'm banning you from calling me by name. You have to call me Otter Uncle, right?
Brilliant.
So I go to colleges, I've gone to MBA colleges, and you're really trying to make this go viral. Which strategy will actually work? You don't know. You've got to fire in all directions.
Exactly.
But the more you make it go viral, and otters lend themselves. They are not like fish. They're so charismatic. They're so beautiful. It's just photos of the otter and talking about what they did is fine. I mean, tomorrow I'm going to put up this Instagram post of an otter playing with carrot, for example. Right? It's so beautiful. How can you not love that animal?
Yes.
So the whole idea is make it just something that's so beautiful that people will stand up when something is happening to it.
Yes, absolutely. And I think you're right. It's I think what you need is a Disney film on otters, where the otter is the main character, and I think everyone will jump in and save the otter. So yeah, so getting people, and not just, I think the point you're trying to make is there's not just the people on the ground who would be the ones saving the otter, but getting people like me, people like those children that you were talking
Right.
to, because it's tigers were not saved because the people in the forestry department decided to save them. They were saved because ordinary people like you and me, decided that that was a cause worth supporting. We were willing to give money towards it. There was, a lot more media.
Yes.
There were films made. So I think it's a collective effort. That sounds fabulous, and I look forward to more stories from Otter Uncle, and and more such posts. So my final question to you, Gopa, is every one of us has maybe an idea of what a fulfilled life looks for us, and that includes our work, our community work, our family, and the whole lot. It's basically our life. What would you say is your definition of a fulfilled life?
Um, that's well. Let's put it. Let me think this through in 2, 3 buckets. And it's kind of intuitive at one level. So it is. Can I make a difference to the planet at the yeah, and I mean a microscopic difference, but a difference to the planet. That would be one, without necessarily neglecting what my duty is, let's say, to the family. For example, my mother, who's pretty infirm at the moment, can I make sure that I still look after her while doing what I really want to do? And at the third level, doing these two with a sense of internal joy, I think is really important. I mean, I have this very dear friend called Hanumant, and one day, some years ago, he asked me, we were doing something, and it was a tough job. And he said, you don't look happy while doing this. And I said, well, we have to do it, but I'm not really happy. We were doing a particular project. And he said, you don't sound happy or look happy. And then he said, if you're not happy, why are you doing it? Right? And it really struck me as something I'd never spent time thinking on. That, you sometimes want to do something and it's at the cost of your individual happiness. And I took that decision then on that I will never take on something that doesn't make me happy, that I don't feel really supercharged about, that I want to come skipping to my office room to work. I just don't want to feel ever that I'm doing something because it's drudgery.
Yes.
I think these are three levels at which I see what a fulfilled life would be. And I don't know if that sort of answers your question, but
No,
that's
it does. It beautifully does. And do you feel that you are living a fulfilled life at the moment?
at the moment, most certainly, yes. Yeah. And I think I made mid-course corrections to that. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. I
And
really skip to work. I must tell you. Yeah.
sorry,
I said I really skip to work.
that's
Yeah.
fabulous. And that's so. It's so. If you had to maybe end our conversation with one message that you want to give to your listeners, about how they can create a fulfilled life for themselves, what would that be?
So I would put it in, I would say two things. One is always follow your path of happiness, because I think many of us don't. And whatever we are doing doesn't appeal to us beyond a point. And it is not at all difficult to attempt to be happy and seek that. That is one thing that I think I learned. I don't think I had it in the beginning, but I learned it. uh, the second one is the whole issue of inequality, and I'm not spouting wisdom here, but I think what everybody, whether there are people working in organization, corporates, whether they're people working on children, elderly people, people with disability, you just name it, everybody understands this fact that our society is horrendously unequal. And conservationists see this in front of them. I mean, the conflict happens because of inequality, right? Uh, I think we have to address inequality. And if we can address it in any way which gives us happiness, which we feel, so not everyone will connect to wildlife conservation. You might connect to education, for example, or healthcare or whatever. But if you can work on this whole issue of inequality and seek to follow your sort of your mojo, whatever, your what really appeals to you in that, probably there is a sense of fulfillment waiting for you there.
I love that. Thank you so much, Gopa. Thank you for your time and your, the work you've done and your work you're doing. And, if there's any way that we can support you, do you have a website or, something we can put in the show notes if people want to get in touch with you to maybe, just get in touch and talk to you?
Yeah, so our website on Otters is riverotter.in, in for India, River Otter, that's singular, not plural, .in. Um, and of course, I'm on Facebook as well. And Facebook is the only social media I'm sort of active on. So, yep. And our organization is called River Otter Conservancy, right?
Is River
So,
Otter one word in the website? River Otter.
yes, it's one word, riverotter.in. Yep.
Oh,
And I think that's got my email ID as well. Yes, it does. It does.
brilliant. Gopa, thank you so much. Really enjoyed this conversation, and thanks so much for your time and for coming and sharing all your experiences with us.
Thank you so much, Rohini. I really enjoyed answering these questions because they were very perceptive questions. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.